So this panel now will focus on the question of how investors could and should react to global geopolitical challenges and everything else that goes along with it. So I, for one, really look forward to the analysis and recommendations that this panel will provide now. And I'm sure you look forward to it too. It will be moderated by Georg Kell. He's the chairman of Arabesque Partners. So please give him and his panelists a very warm welcome.
Maybe we sit in the order we speak.
I will sit in that order.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure. We intend to have a dialogue here, a dialogue about systemic threats and what investors can do. This is a tough challenge for us because, as we just heard, systemic issues have big challenges in themselves. They're highly complex and interrelated. But we have a wonderful panel here. We have David Wood from the Kennedy School, who has done extensive research on inequality. Helga Birgden, from a partner at Mercer. She also has done leading research work on migration. And Jason Mitchell, who has been writing and following extensively the whole migration and refugee issues over the last years. By way of setting our discussion, let me be a bit provocative and just try to paint a picture that is half dark and half sunny. And we all know that we have cognitive biases. We're often not able to learn from the past, or we forget the lessons of past, as we were just reminded. And we also know, in general terms, we are not very good at coming to grips with uncertainty. Human beings want to have certainty behind everything. So if one were to describe the world we are in, and Mervyn King coined that wonderful term, we live in an era of radical uncertainty. Radical uncertainty meaning that the future is ever more unpredictable, and the scenarios ahead of us are very stark in contrast. So let me just throw a few dark sides at you, and then some sunny sides, and then invite you to dwell in your respective topics. On the dark side, I think we all know the blanket of civilization everywhere is razor thin, and it needs cultivation, as we just heard. We also know in human history, it's a history of violence and wars and hate, unfortunately. Can we move into a new era? We also know that the spread of markets and technological change often outpaces society's capacities to keep pace with it, and for political systems to guide their directions. We also know that as we move into the digital economy, that income inequality will become an ever bigger challenge. And we also know that on human settlement and refugees, we already have the biggest crisis in modern history, with 60 million people worldwide being displaced, 20 million people being refugees. And it's not difficult to imagine how a cocktail of demographic ticking time bombs, which we know are in the making, combined with climate change, can lead to massive, massive challenges. That's kind of the dark side. Now, the sunny side, the good news clearly is that we also know that humanity, what connects us, tends to be stronger than what divides us, provided we can mobilize it. And this is PRI, a great, great global community where this understanding is actually the basis. We also know that we live in a time where, thanks to technology, we can solve basically any problem, provided we have the will to do so. We also know the private sector is increasingly willing to step up. We saw it in the US, where corporates, for example, doubled down on climate action, despite the administration leaving the Paris Accord. We saw the corporate world taking a stand on human rights, despite an attack on human rights. We also know the digital revolution enables investors now to clearly link more sustainable companies with actually good long-term performance, and thereby have the ability, through deep ESG investment, to redirect capital towards more responsible, sustainable business, and thereby tackle some of the big root causes we are facing here. And we know that young people everywhere, have almost a natural inclination to speak up for justice and fairness, and are actually willing to learn some of the tough lessons. So with that kind of dark and sunny side, I want to invite now our panelists to do a bit of a deep drill on some of these big picture issues. And mind you, we did not talk about the nuclear threat because geopolitical challenges, of course, overshadow all of our economic, social, and governance agenda. But I think we are fully conscious of it, and we will refer to some of these linkages. So start with David. David, you have done extensive work on inequality. Can you shine some light on how whether investors should actually pay attention to these issues? And if so, how can they go about? It's a highly complex issue, the so-called S in the ESG agenda, not easy to quantify, but what's your take on it?
Thanks. Thanks to PRI for having me here. For the last year or so, we have been going around the world with PRI, workshopping a paper on economic inequality and responsible investment. It's been great fun, I've learned a lot. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned. I should say up front that I was just thrown for a loop. Georg explicitly said he wasn't going to bring up the nuclear threat on stage. And he went right there, right before I talked. Also, I got nervous when I came in here last night and saw the size of the room, and there were 1,000 people here. So I went home after dinner and wrote a 30-minute speech. And I have 8 minutes. And he had a heart attack when he saw it.
7 minutes.
So now I have 3 points in illegible scrawl that I'm going to describe to you. So we'll start now. 3 points. Why should investors care about the topic? Second, some implications of recent research on economic inequality that I think are relevant to responsible investment. And then third, maybe what can investors do, or what's investors' role in what we all have to do? I think it's sometimes a mistake to put too much on investors. So first of all, why should investors care? I came to this topic with my colleague Jay Youngdahl at the IRI for really 2 reasons. One, it was a politically salient topic. It was Occupy Wall Street. President Obama had said this is the defining issue of our time. Economic inequality was being called out as an important element of political society, and investors should have some response or reaction to it. Secondly, we have a program at the Initiative for Responsible Investment, which is my research project, called the Trustee Leadership Forum for Retirement Security. We work with labor-affiliated pension fund trustees. And internationally, there's a sort of umbrella group called the Committee for Workers' Capital, with representatives from North America, Europe, South Africa, Japan, Australia, et cetera. That group was focusing on the S in ESG and the absence of attention to the S in ESG. And economic inequality seemed to be a sort of covering term or a paradigmatic issue to the S like climate was to the E. So it seemed important on its own right, but it seemed important within the context of responsible investment to take up this, what people saw as a lack. Finally, inequality is important for sort of instrumental and ethical reasons at the same time, and I want to keep both in mind. Instrumentally, what the new research shows, which I'll talk about in a second, is that inequality can harm economic growth. Excessive inequality is a burden on growth, and that's a burden for investors. But it's also, and this really comes from the work with the pension fund trustees, it's keenly felt in the lives of beneficiaries. It's not just that it's going to hurt their portfolios, but they themselves are suffering because of a social problem. So, what does the research say? You've all seen graphs. They all go like this. On this side is the capture of the very top 1%, or 0.5%, or 0.1%. We've concentrated economic, the gains from income and also wealth to the right over the past 30 years, 30, 40, depending on the study. And the results are, I wrote this last night, I said the results are sobering, or they'll drive you to drink. I'm not sure which. It's, it goes both ways. A little less clear is why this has happened. There's certainly political and structural changes to the global economy, to the way that we tax people, to the way that goods and income flows that have had their implications. But more interesting is why inequality might repress growth. That's new. It used to be that inequality was the price of growth. And now the research is suggesting, especially from the OECD and the IMF, so organizations which weren't sort of thought to be projecting this, that inequality can depress growth for reasons of, depress demand. People, mass consumers, have less money and they can't buy as many Ford automobiles. Perhaps it allows for rent seeking and political capture. People with the means can control the political system to make sure they keep the means, and that stifles innovation or economic change. But one of the really interesting findings, and this resonated, so when we were in Tokyo, it was right after the US election, and people said, this is a question of social cohesion. When you lose social cohesion, society begins to fall apart. Of course the economy is going to begin to suffer. Post-Brexit in London and New York, the same things came up. When we were in South Africa, inequality was seen as the sign that political instability was a cause of this fundamental rupture in the political and economic safety of South African citizens. And this idea of social cohesion resonated, and I think fits in with what my colleagues are going to talk about. It also suggests inequality as a sign of something going wrong. There's a level of inequality that suggests something bad might happen. The economist James Galbraith has a great metaphor. He says inequality is like blood pressure. If you're at 0, the body's inert, right? You want to have some inequality because you want to have some movement and dynamism in society. But if it's too high, you're running a high risk of a heart attack. So if that's the research, and we have a discussion paper, I'll point you to things. The question is, what can investors do? And this is where the S and ESG question became very interesting to me, because it's a structural issue, and it's not at all clear that investors can fix the political and social structures that are driving this change, nor that they should. In fact, as I'll say in a second, investors are on the hook because they've caused a lot of inequality. There's clearly a role, or the laundry list of topics in the S and ESG, and there's a great paper PRI put out on assessing the S and ESG this fall that catalogs them. Economic inequality looks like a covering term that covers a lot of them. Things like how you evaluate what you're investing in for compensation, for precarious work, for the right to collective bargaining, human and labor rights. All of these are issues that allow you to assess how a corporation or a firm is contributing to inequality and maybe causing long-term instability. But at the structural level, I think inequality calls for a little more intense reflection on the role of investors. So the PRI has been having a very interesting discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 10, if you want to know the number, is reduced inequalities. Economic inequality is only one of the inequalities, gender, racial, there's lots more to think about. But the SDGs are an opportunity for especially private investors, the kind of investors in this room, to work with other kinds of investors. The complementary work between public banks, promotional banks, development finance institutions, with institutional investors, that's an area in order to try to mitigate inequality. And I have to say the sort of way that those institutions work together leaves a lot to be desired. And I'm supposed to stop, so you're flinching.
Wonderful, David.
Can I do 30 more seconds?
Yes, please, and try to wrap up, and also try to go a bit deeper. What do you see already happening on the investor side? Or is this just a wish list?
Oh, and I just want them to do what I'm saying. Okay. So I'm supposed to wrap up and go deeper. That's a fantastic set of instructions. I'm going to choose the latter.
Fair enough.
No, just so the other thing is the PRI blueprint. I love the PRI blueprint because it says ESG is not enough. That's the techniques we use, but you have to think about a sustainable financial system and you have to think about the real world. That's a real evolution in responsible investment. Economic inequality is a topic where that can become manifest. Here's one thing investors are doing. They're talking about tax avoidance and the role where you might benefit any individual company, but a tax structure which allows for inequality is going to long-term harm you. That's a topic that this drives. The last thing I'll say is financialization. I heard a talk by John Kay a couple days ago where he said, well, financialization, a word I don't like, he said, I love it, drives inequality, both because of the accumulation of profits to the financial sector, but also the ways that companies have changed. The way that workers are treated and the fissuring of the workplace is what David Weil calls it, as a result of financialization. Well, that's something investors can participate in. How do we have a more sustainable financial system? So I think there's lots that can be done. There are initial talks, but we have yet to tease out the full implications of the problem.
Great, David. I thank you so much. This was a first deep dive into inequality. I'm sure we come back to that big subject, we want to switch now to another big theme, migration, which is also huge, has many root causes and consequences, and we're very lucky to have actually two world-leading experts in this area. And I want to start with Helga Birgden. And Helga, you will have some slides, which you will quickly blend in. Helga, the floor is yours now.
Yes, thanks, George. I'd like to, thank you, David, go to what I hope is the light side to show that we actually can do something about immigration. Is there a clicker for the slides? So
It was going to be there, but it's here.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks a lot. Cool. And so I would like to talk about the investment implications. But just to start, I want to set the scene a little bit. And I want to just reflect on the S in ESG and talk about the economic case, and then why as investors we can really do something. So we know 1 billion people have been lifted out of extreme poverty over the last 20 years, but the income gaps between high and low countries are 70 to 1. So it's a massive gap. And if we drill into involuntary migration and just think about the women, involuntary migrants who work, the nannies, the sex workers, the maids, the smuggled girls and women experience further inequality when they go to receiving countries. And these women as involuntary migrants are not an empowered proletariat, they're modern day slaves and serving classes, but they do participate in economic growth sectors. So involuntary migration is largely currently disregarded by investors, by us, but it does impact business, it impacts government, it has an influence on policy and labour, as we've heard from Georg. So we know there's a developing regulation, modern slavery, supply chain analysis, and the impact of companies. But what does this really mean for investors? We need new lenses, these sort of things, and we have to really identify our blind spots. So at Mercer, we help investors manage to a wider set of risks. We take a wider view and we recognise complexity in the economics of investing. And we take as a baseline the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. And in that, the 2017 report, involuntary migration is identified as the most interconnected global risk. And what we can do, I think, is that we can look at what does this social issue mean for us? How can we apply our traditional investment thinking to a social system issue like involuntary migration? And in order to achieve sustainable growth, there is a 4-step easy way to think about this. We start off with our investment beliefs and we incorporate these social system issues like migration. We think about our policy settings. Are our policies capturing these wider issues? Then our investment process. And then the ultimate test, how are we incorporating social issues like migration within the portfolio? And I think there's ways of breaking it out. We start with our investment beliefs. Beliefs really frame everything we do. So the belief is capitalism generates wealth, it decreases poverty, it brings energy order. There's alternative evidence that capitalism creates exponential inequality. The OECD, the Congressional Budget Office and the IMF have published studies showing that income inequality has been increasing for the past several decades. Energy return on investment has been in decline. There's a decline in social cohesion. For example, we can look at the Arab Springs and see a period of about 15 to 20 years before we see state system failure. So with policy, we're seeing many investors now around the globe, large institutional investors, beginning to think about geostrategic issues. And we're seeing the rise of laws, as we've been hearing at this conference, about financing a sustainable European economy, the French duty of care law, Dutch due diligence of labour law, Swiss responsible investment business initiative. So there's a change in the way the policy is developing, and we as investors need to respond. But which path should we go down? There are plenty of frameworks and initiatives, and we need to look to unconventional sources, but rigorous sources. So World Economic Forum I've mentioned, Cambridge Global Risk Index, Verisk Maplecroft Human Rights Outlook. These are all data sources that investors and some of the managers I've been speaking to in my research are starting to look into. We also need to recognise that as investors, we are framed by our economic thinking, and we need to move away from neoclassical thinking about the economy to possibly what Kate Raworth has called donut economics. And the idea of donut economics is that the environmental and social parts of the economy are absolutely critical to the investment thesis. So the outside of the donut is the environment, and the inside of the donut is the social and justice order. And unless we have those two parameters, our business, investment, and economic activity will fall through the hole in the donut, and it will implode. So we need to build new ways of thinking about the economy and the process, our investment process. The adage, what gets measured gets managed, is really important here. And we're seeing many institutional investors asking for evidence in investment management processes for identifying human rights issues, labour issues, social indicators and policy indicators. And we're also seeing new measures. Finally, the portfolio. This is where rubber really hits the road, and we need to be able to incorporate issues pertaining to involuntary migration and all of the drivers that relate to it, climate change, conflict, war, weak governance, etc., by incorporating geostrategic themes in our macroeconomic research and bottom-up stock selection. We're seeing progressive investment management thinking about sovereign risk, emerging market risk premia. Is it really capturing this most globally interconnected risk, this social impact? And finally, relating to the economic model, we need new models. Our beliefs drive what our models say, and so we need to move away from our weddedness to stochastic modelling, neoclassical thinking, and tell the story. The story is disruption, it's fat tails, it's wide dispersion, and mean, normal distribution and equilibrium really don't stack up when it comes to these issues. Yep. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, Helga. This was a wonderful deep dive on economic rationale, and you also gave us a framework why social issues should be more systematically be integrated, and which obviously dovetails very well with the ESG agenda and the overlap of public-private interests and the whole materiality notions and the measurement concepts behind it. Very powerful, very important, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But now we have also a world-leading expert who actually has written with great precision over the last 2 years or so on the refugee crisis, especially here in Europe. And you also established the link with the policy regimes and to close the circle on the populism side. So Jason, we're very happy to have you here. You feel free if you want to use slide, but I think it would be great if you could speak from where you are.
I'll speak from my notes, but if anyone's interested in my slides, I'm more than happy to send them to you. The first thing I'd like to say is that over the past 1.5 to 2 years, covering the migrant crisis from Calais to northern Lesbos to Turkey, and most recently off the Libyan coast on a search and rescue boat, I've learned that when we tend to think of voluntary and involuntary migrants, i.e. refugees, we think of them in a static sense. But the reality is their conditions are fluid, and these these terminologies, and even the IOM and UNHCR would agree with this, are blurring. And I say that because if you took an economic migrant from Ghana, for instance, who had worked in the services sector and agriculture, for instance, in Libya 5 years ago, he typically would be there working and remitting payments back to his home country. Now, as a failed state, he is, by any definition, an involuntary migrant, a refugee. His wages are being withheld, there's discrimination, and he's most likely sort of in fear of his life. And those are the people that I ran into, and I think it's an important thing to note. Why is this important? From a populist perspective, we've seen over the last year the fact that Eurosceptic parties represent a destabilizing force, not just to national politics, but to EU politics, and certainly to markets. It looked like even with migrant inflows peaking out in Germany, you've still seen the AfD, by the results on Sunday, I think they did 13.5%. They were polling at around 10% about a month ago. So there is continued momentum behind these far-right parties. The Italian elections are next. They'll have it before May of 2018. And what's interesting about it is there's a very tight correlation. Even though the absolute number of migrants are significantly lower, there's a very tight correlation over the last 1 to 2 years of the increase in migrants and the polling support for the Five Star Movement and the Northern League. And so from an EU perspective, as well as from an Italian perspective, the question is, how can we redistribute the migrants across Europe? We've obviously seen court cases between Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, which have sided with the EU, but realize that there was an agreement about a year ago to redistribute 160,000 migrants between Italy and Greece, and only 25 to 30,000 have actually been relocated. What does this mean for the markets? We think, on one end, there will be a lot of stimulus, which should be market positive. If you look at Germany as an example, they've sort of set the bar at with 2 million of refugee inflows at 12,000 euros per refugee. I mean, that is equivalent to roughly 30 billion of financial support, and adds sort of a tail of 15 to 20 basis points of stimulus to GDP growth. The question is, about the integration of these. I mean, this has been a 2-year integration process. 500,000 people have been integrated into a training program, but out of that 2 million figure, only 50,000 people have been successfully integrated into the labor force today. And so the expectation is that because of language issues, and also because of sort of the idiosyncratic education system within Germany, which really focuses on vocational work, that 2-year program is extended to 3 or 4. The potential is that the far-right parties tend to politicize incremental spending around this and the integration issues, which we worry about. One thing that I'd love to talk about is the fact that when we think about the European migrant crisis, we tend to look at it through Europe's lens. And the reality is there are significant implications for emerging markets. Specifically, we ask ourselves this question a lot, which is, to what degree do the flow of migrants, particularly from sub-Saharan Africa, reflect diminishing economic opportunity? And I'm not saying in all of Africa. There's a lot of economic opportunity in countries like Rwanda and Kenya. I'm speaking specifically in parts of West Africa and Central Africa, where investors participate in frontier markets. Now, we know that there are cyclical factors. Commodity price volatility has hurt oil-dependent economies like Nigeria. We know that capital flows and trade volumes have rebounded, but they have yet to recover like developed countries post the great financial crisis. We know that there are structural issues that we've talked about a little bit. Inequality, although the picture of Gini coefficients across that area, it doesn't prove a completely clear picture. demographic forces. Generally when we think of the literature around migration, it's been driven by wage differentials, income differentials. But now what we're seeing is different structural factors start to drive that. So for instance, climate migration. The term climate refugee is yet to be recognized under the UNHCR, which is interesting. Demographic forces, as I mentioned. Failed states. The Ghanaian that I'd mentioned when I opened, at one point before the fall of Gaddafi, Libya hosted as many as 2.5 million migrants who went up there in a relatively safe environment with rule of law, would work and remit payments back to that country. Those jobs there, as well as to some degree in Iraq and Syria and Egypt, no longer exist in at least the same format. And so the question we ask is, from an emerging markets perspective, how do you get comfortable and how do you sort of predict future migrant flows? Now, clearly the answer in a forum like this is to talk up the power of impact investing, which no doubt is important and critical in a time for this. But the one thing that I would really make 2 points around is that we live in a very delicate time in some of these markets. Because on one hand, you have the United States, the largest donor, at least talking about a 37% cut to its development budget, and the UK talking about it, yet though still investing 0.7% of GDP. UK is obviously the third donor. Part of that goes into disaster relief, but a very big part of that goes into institution building, which is critical as investors. There are some success stories when it comes to institution building. If you look at the debt management office, they've been critical in managing Nigeria's debt, which leads me to my last issue, that as an emerging markets investor, when you weigh potentially the withdrawal of critical multilateral funding for something like institution building, you also have to counterbalance it with the fact that over the last 7 years, the low rate environment has encouraged a significant amount of Eurobond issuance. In 2005, we had a big debt cancellation, if you remember, for many of these countries. And yet now, 12 years later, a number of them sit with a lot of leverage on their balance sheets. Ghana's at 70% debt to GDP. Zambia and Angola are at 60%. Mozambique is in technical default. And so when our emerging markets debt team looks at sovereign debt, the first thing they go to in terms of understanding country risk and governance risk is the World Bank World Governance Indicators, which measures institutional strength, the judicial arm, the regulatory bodies, and transparency and accountability. And I don't want to leave it on a negative note, but it's something that we really do worry about, and that certainly might influence future migratory flows if you do have a big cutback in multilateral funding.
Thank you, Jason, for this wonderful summing up of current thinking. I think the common thread both on the inequality and the migration issue is that the economic rationale is pretty stark and pretty clear why investors should pay attention. I think we also heard some pathways of solutions, if not frameworks. We have 8 minutes left. I want to challenge all three of you, maybe with a wishful question. In the corporate world, we talk increasingly about corporate statesmanship, meaning business leaders recognizing that the shared public good is actually of essential interest for long-term success. In the investment world, we talk about stewardship, the idea of stewardship codes and their relevance for sensitizing, mobilizing such issues and accelerating their integration. How do you stand to that? First question. The second question, if you have any concrete examples where you can tell already how individual investors have already made some inroads, so to speak, in integrating some of these big issues. So 2 questions, one on the big picture, market sustainability overall, the voice of investors and their interaction with policymakers, and one on the concrete side, already in the ongoing investment practices, are there some examples that are noteworthy? Maybe we start just around, or Helga, you want to start?
I just wanted to go to the concrete.
Yeah.
Would I be able to put up one slide?
Okay,
Come on, let me.
if it's not longer than 1 minute.
I know I'm a slide addict. I can't help it. I just wanted to, sorry, I don't know. Maybe it's actually going into someone else's presentation. Sorry.
Well, can
I
you?
won't. Okay, I won't. Sorry. Well, I just wanted to say that I actually did a small piece of research, a kind of a straw poll of what investors are doing about social system risk. And in particular, I interviewed 10 of the world's large investment firms about involuntary migration and what it means and whether they incorporate it as a factor in their investments. And I had a slide there of kind of a heat map of the extent to which large investors are thinking about this sort of issue. And it was very interesting to me. I was absolutely fascinated. I ended up usually talking to people in risk management and macroeconomic research, but many large institutional investors are engaged on thinking about the connectivity of migration connected to climate change, conflict, etc., and are building products in some cases where they use human rights assessment, labour rights assessments using ESG portfolio company research. And I was extremely surprised to see the extent to which this social issue, and migration in particular, which I interviewed them about, was coming through, not as an isolated issue, but rather as the outworking of these other factors. So the heat map kind of has a relative amount of green, so it's a very 2017 issue, and I really do want to commend that work that these institutional investors are undertaking and really appeal to asset owners to jump in the driver's seat on this issue. It's so important, it's so connected to stability, cohesion, and the economic result that we're all looking for.
Very good. That's a very important noted, I hope, for everybody in here. Please, Jason.
I'd also add, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of it, but I'm definitely encouraged by the fact that there's an increasing body of research out. I first met David Wood out at Boston at the PRI CFA event, where there was a lot of discussion about how to define labor issues, undocumented workers. I've started to see more of that on the sell side as well, in terms of trying to define a process. I sort of give my hats off to specifically Kepler-Chevreau, who's really looked at sort of the impact or some examples of undocumented workers and within the UK, specifically a company called Greencore.
Very good. David, you have?
Yeah, well, I try not to dabble in the concrete, so I'll go to your first question.
Okay.
On
you can go deep.
Yeah, that's good. So on this sort of systems, the way we work through the S is through norms, and I think there are various ways to, Eleanor Ostrom's work about governing the commons suggests it doesn't always have to come from the public sector.
Right.
But we need to have some kind of collective rule. It seems to me that, one, inequality is a measure of the success of the financial system in a certain way, and so it can become the basis for a norm for how we measure it. But I don't see how the public sector isn't, engaged directly from the top, and the role of investors is to contribute to what that looks like in the working out of that principle. On the concrete side, I mean, there are definitely products that are in development that are meant to take social cohesion into account. In the US, they tend to run as community development investments. I heard a great presentation on the Solidarity Fund in Quebec the other day, which looks at what is needed, a social audit for what is needed in a community, and then works backwards to the assumed rate of return. That's an investment vehicle that kind of prioritizes social cohesion in theory. The IMF has an inclusive, IFC, has an inclusive growth bond, but it's still early days to see like a real concentrated effort to tackle the problem.
No, excellent. I may add here, I'm personally very fascinated also about how big data is now allowing investors to capture actually the risk and opportunity side from a very fresh angle. and making through smart algorithm, applying technology for a good purpose and not abusing it, and applying that knowledge into better informed investment products. So I think there's a whole revolution also going on the data side, which hopefully will drive these issues further. But we have 2 minutes left, and I want to do one short thought as trying to sum up, and then invite you, each of you, to do likewise. We are living in a paradox world because we're ever more interdependent, no doubt. Technology, information continues to spread around the world, yet our collective ability to proactively tackle some of the issues doesn't seem to keep step with that. Multilateral systems are weakening and so forth. So don't you think there could also be a role for investors on the stewardship code side to raise the voices now and then a bit above the immediate concern, and maybe PRI could even play a role there? And the great link with the UN is here, with the Sustainable Development Goals, to amplify some of these messages. So in other words, how do you see that potential of stewardship code thinking, also getting some big picture issues across to policymakers? Is that of relevance, or is that just pipe dream?
I think it's fundamental if we're to be hopeful.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say my example with the emerging markets, I think it's absolutely critical to trying to understand the sort of risk within these markets, and advocate for, you know, better governance at a national level, not just a corporate level.
Very good. I think we covered two very big issues, migration and income inequality. The experts are here. Their knowledge and their expertise, I believe, is available also on the PRI website to quite some extent. Please look it up. These are big issues that will be with us for years to come, that's for sure. It will shape policymaking. It will shape the rules of the game. It will influence risks and opportunities in a very, very big scale. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you all.